No, he was a great man in many ways. He was also, of course, a terrible man in many ways, and a ruthless man. He was, you might say, the man of the moment. There's a great famous quote from Edmund Burke's book, Reflections on the Revolution in France. I should have written his name up here. Ironically, I'm putting it in red because Burke, of course, is considered the father of modern conservatism. Even the concept of conservatism, remember how I said that left and right came from really the French Revolution, the National Convention. The idea of conservatism, that is, as a philosophy of either resisting change or trying to preserve existing institutions, this too was born of the French Revolution. Now, Burke was a bit ahead of his time. He actually wrote his famous book, Reflections on the Revolution in France. He wrote this all the way back in 1790, when, as you may remember, the revolution was still in its early phase. It had not yet gotten that radical. In fact, most people outside France still saw it, at least on balance, at least the educated classes, as potentially a good thing. That is, the reform of absolutism, the rising up of some form of popular sovereignty, an assembly or a parliament. But Burke kind of looked to the essence of what had already happened in France. I think I talked about this idea of a nation of lawyers. That is, that it was essentially the lawyers who had taken control of the cahiers de doléances, these grievances sent in, the lawyers who had been elected to the Estates General, the lawyers who had declared the National Assembly. And what Burke said about this, he said, look, you can never really trust a lawyer. Basically, you have all these people who now have a vested interest in turning things upside down. I mean, if you think about it, like let's say you're a divorce lawyer. You handle marriage divorces, right? Do you want there to be more divorce or less? More. It's good for business. The same thing is true of a property lawyer. You'd rather there be a lot of buying and selling, or shall we say looting or stealing. The church, remember, they nationalize the church property, they sell some of it, they issue bonds on behalf of it. The bonds, the assignats, they turn into a currency. There's a lot of uncertainty. Uncertainty is great for lawyers. It's good for business. So what Burke basically said is, look, this is not at all the kind of revolution you want. This is not a revolution trying to uphold existing principles. It's actually, to some people, a paradox that Burke was more or less a supporter of the American Revolution. That's not to say he sent money or anything to the American revolutionaries, but he saw it as not necessarily the worst thing, because the American revolutionaries, they were claiming old rights. They were talking about things like the right to representation. They didn't want to be taxed without representation. They claimed that their rights as Englishmen, their ancient rights as subjects of the crown, were being violated. Whereas the French Revolution, as we saw, rapidly spiraled out of control as new rights and theories were being created as if out of thin air. Laws and parchments, old traditions like mortmain, were being obliterated, annihilated without trace. He saw this as dangerous. He said there's only one direction this can lead. Eventually a tyranny on behalf of the parliament, and then probably a tyranny on behalf of the mob. And as he saw all the way back in 1790, eventually he said you would get a dictatorship. This is actually in your reading on page 121 of the Napoleon section. This is when he talks about this notion of obedience, that is, an army's obedience. And he said, popular assemblies, it is known that armies have hitherto yielded a very precarious and uncertain obedience to any senate or popular authority. The main evidence of this being, of course, ancient Rome and eventually the fall of the Republic, the civil wars leading to men like Caesar and Pompey, and then Octavian and Mark Antony. Men who could command the obedience of the legions eventually controlled the popular assembly. He said the officers must totally lose the characteristic disposition of military men if they see with perfect submission and due admiration the dominion of pleaders, that is, lawyers. Especially when they find that they have a new court to pay to an endless succession of those pleaders, that is, again, the lawyers. In the weakness of one kind of authority, remember, the Parliament started off very strong and then eventually was actually taken over by the mob, who would literally invade it when they disagreed with certain opinions. In the fluctuation of all, that is, in the chaos or anarchy that he saw descending on Paris and France, the officers of an army will remain for some time mutinous and full of faction, until some popular general who understands the art of conciliating the soldiery, who possesses the true spirit of command, shall draw the eyes of all men upon himself. Armies will obey him on his personal account. There is no other way of securing military obedience in this state of things. But the moment in which that event shall happen, the person who really commands the army is your master, the master of your king, the master of your assembly, the master of your whole republic. Again, the remarkable thing about this passage, about the entire book, is that he wrote it in 1790. He wrote it, that is, a full, shall we say, 9 years before Napoleon had really asserted his authority over France. Before anyone even knew who Napoleon was, before anyone had heard of Napoleon, when Napoleon was in fact a subaltern of 21 years old. Burke simply said, this is where things are inevitably going to lead. Yes, reading the tea leaves, you might say, of ancient Rome, Burke saw that a country like England, like Great Britain, was able to resist this sort of thing. Not because it had any magical qualities, but because over the centuries, certain traditions had built up. Going back to the Magna Carta, the separation of power, first between nobles and king, then eventually between parliament and king. That essentially it just came down to tradition. You had a tradition of at least the idea of liberty, the idea of powers being separated, the idea of the government not having the right of authority over people that the assembly was claiming, not the right of authority over life and limb unless people committed crimes. This would all take centuries to develop. And what he saw happening in France was that whatever traditions had existed, maybe they were good traditions, maybe they were bad, they were now being overturned in this moment, year zero fashion that could lead to nothing but anarchy and eventually to tyranny and dictatorship. So he was kind of clairvoyant. Now, it's not necessarily true that the man Napoleon was destined to do this, but Burke had a point that probably eventually it was going to happen. We talked about the anarchy in Paris, the fact that the mob had taken the king and queen, you remember, first from Versailles with the mob of housewives. Then they had invaded the Tuileries and massacred the Swiss guards. Then they had invaded the parliament itself. The mob, which had kind of become this force, this primal force controlling politics. But of course, no one really controls a mob, or I suppose more literally speaking, no one can control a mob permanently. You might temporarily have the support of the mob like Robespierre, but then the mob might change their mind. That was as true in ancient Rome as it was in modern Paris. And so eventually, if France was not going to descend into anarchy, probably someone did have to come along and do this. Now, Napoleon was as good a candidate as anyone, partly because of his skills and his talent, but also, I think, to some extent, some of his ruthlessness and the singularity of his vision came from the fact that he was not French, not by birth. Does anyone know where Napoleon came from? Corsica, right. An island which is closer to Italy than France. It's off the coast of Italy. An island which had for a long time gone back and forth between different rulers. Most recently, right before Napoleon was born, the old Italian city-state of Genoa, which the French had temporarily ruled and then gave it back. The French took it over again, in fact, either the year of Napoleon's birth or I think the year after Napoleon was born. Napoleon was born in 1769. And so it was kind of an accident that he became a subject of the French crown, almost by accident, because France took Corsica over from the Genoese. It's neither here nor there. Some people think that he might have inherited some of the old kind of Italian tradition of the condottieri or the guerrillas, the Maquis country of Corsica, the old blood vendetta code of vengeance that you tended to have in rough-hewn places like this. But I don't think that really explains Napoleon's character very well, because although he was interested in Corsican affairs until he was maybe in his early 20s. After that, he forgot about Corsica, and he never even went back. He was very much, in that sense, almost a man without a past, or at least a man who did not need a past. But the fact that he was an outsider, this is something to keep in mind. If you look at some of history's greatest, or at least most notorious conquerors, there is a curious thing that they have in common. Alexander, for example, Iskender the Great. He used the Greek legions, the great phalanx of the Greeks, in order to conquer half the known world, or most of the known world at the time. But he himself was not born in mainland Greece. He came from what we now call Macedonia, or Macedonia. Yes, it was kind of on the fringes of the Hellenic world, but he was still an outsider. He was, and his father, Philip II of Macedon, they were conquerors of Greece before they used Greek soldiers to make their own conquests. Hitler, we remember, in the 20th century, was not born German. He was born in Austria. And so to a certain extent, he both admired German culture and he wanted to use it, but he also saw himself as something of an outsider. I mean, there may also be something very prosaic here. If you are not really by birth and by inclination a member of that country, maybe you see the soldiers, the lives of people of that country as something expendable. You may not care quite as much about the lives of the soldiery. You see them almost as tools. That's another way of looking at Napoleon. That's it. So anyway, where did he come from? He comes from Corsica, basically by accident. When France takes Corsica over from the city-state of Genoa, he becomes a subject of France. He's sometimes said he was a self-made man. That's not entirely true. He came from kind of the lower ranks of the Corsican nobility. They had however many quarterings you needed. I mean, they were definitely properly born with all of the right titles, but they weren't very rich. Now, when France sent its kind of governor to Corsica, he actually did have a kind of authority to give certain, almost like a scholarship, to members of the nobility from Corsica to study at French schools. So Napoleon was essentially then enrolled in the military schools in France, and he wasn't necessarily at the top of his class. The one skill he particularly had, though, which served him very well throughout his life, was in mathematics. He had a kind of innate genius. Some of it was also for visualization, for kind of map reading. You know, he could look at a map and he could practically picture the mountains, the rivers, the valleys. He could imagine how you would march an army from one area to another. He could calculate it then, how many days you would need. But mathematics was also, of course, particularly important for artillery, for targeting. Now, artillery was not anywhere near as sophisticated as it would be in the 20th century. However, you still needed to have a basic grasp of something like the parabola of the curve of the trajectory of a cannonball. You had to have a certain notion of precision. Trigonometry certainly helped. I mean, it wasn't anywhere near, again, as precise as modern weaponry, but it still helped. More than that, though, I think the mathematics helped with the calculations of things like logistics, supply. He had a head for all of these kinds of things. He also had, I think it's probably fair to say, a kind of military genius. He just had an instinct. Some people have it, some don't. He obviously had it. He first makes his name. The first time he kind of appears almost, you might say, on the radar was at the Siege of Toulon in 1793. This is when the British, Toulon being on the southern French coast of the Mediterranean, the British were bombarding this city. Napoleon, it's important to remember, he was sort of on the side of the revolution. It's not that he was by any great conviction a revolutionary. He was very much, shall we say, pragmatic, you know, a career man. In fact, he almost got into trouble because he was at least a supporter enough of the National Convention that after Robespierre's fall, he was briefly imprisoned. I think because Robespierre's brother had given him his new commission or something like that. It didn't last because they realized that he wasn't really a great ideologue of Robespierre, and beside the army needed his talent. But anyway, so at the Siege of Toulon, I suppose his main kind of innovation there, aside from his mad bravery, that was the other thing. I mean, he took no notion of, you know, some people have this stoicism, they're in the middle of a battle and they don't get scared. And Napoleon was obviously like that. He would take great risks. But he decided they were first trying to eject the royalists from Toulon. But Napoleon decided that the British were actually more important because they controlled the sea. And so he actually targeted the British Navy directly, and he started firing on them from the shore. And he actually scored a number of direct hits. This was the first time he encountered a British character called Sidney Smith, who, aside from having a nice alliterative name, he plays a role in all these conflicts, almost as Napoleon's foil. And he's a fascinating character who actually, for a time, shows up in the service of the Sultan in Istanbul for much of the 1790s and Constantinople, before taking a commission in the British Navy again and defeating Napoleon after Napoleon had invaded Syria. I don't want to get ahead of the story, but Sidney Smith and Napoleon, they have kind of their first encounter at this battle. They both survive. They both develop a kind of respect for the other. And Napoleon apparently came very close to being, knocked out of action in this battle. And, the British famously later said, that had only Napoleon, had the shell landed like 6 inches to the right, then possibly we wouldn't have had to deal with, the 25 years of war to follow. Now, I don't know if that's true, but there is a curious thing about Napoleon. This is actually true of a lot of history's great commanders. He wasn't very tall. And that actually helps when you think about it, because, he would have come up to maybe about here on me. So that basically, if you think like a shell is going to come at you like this, he has an extra 6 inches of leeway, because it's easier to survive. This was actually true of Nelson, the great British naval commander. He was also, I think he was even shorter than Napoleon. And, he would be up there on the quarterdecks in the middle of battle. Although, in the end, Nelson actually was felled in part because he didn't camouflage his appearance. He actually wore all of his stars and, medals. And it was said that the French sniper who finally shot Nelson actually saw his jewels glistening in the sun, and so was able to target him. Whereas Napoleon was actually a lot more sensible about that. Like he would wear his battle clothes, but he would put over almost not camouflage exactly, but like a dull colored gray coat or something, so that he wouldn't stand out in the battle. Well, anyway, he distinguishes himself partly from his bravery and elan, partly from the way he is just able to get the best out of his men, and the fact that he used the artillery properly. Some of it is that he wouldn't waste shell. He would make sure that his men would wait until the right moment to fire. They would target it as properly as they could. He was able to concentrate his fire as much as possible on a single target. Again, he just had an innate genius for battle, and everyone recognized it. He actually skipped several ranks. He went straight up to brigadier general after this battle. And so he's the man. He's rising. He's only 24. This is actually true also of a lot of revolutionary movements. If you look at what happens in Turkey after the Young Turk Revolution, right up to World War I, in part because they're fighting so many battles and wars, and in part because they have this almost like cult of youth, you ended up having people, making general by the age of 30. Enver Pasha was war minister when he was 31. It was a little bit like that in France in the Revolution. And again, it's partly because so many people are dying, One of the great paradoxes of the Napoleonic era is that Napoleon himself obviously killed more Frenchmen than anyone in history in terms of the numbers who died in battle. And yet the men, they supported him. And you'd think they wouldn't like the fact that so many of them were dying, but on the other hand, it's not necessarily an unmitigated bad thing if you're in the army to have a lot of other people in the army die, because it means you get to ascend very rapidly. You come up through the ranks. And some of that, again, was because of the revolution. They believed a bit more in meritocracy. You no longer needed to be high-born to move up through the army. Napoleon from the lower nobility makes general by 24. It epitomizes, you might call it social mobility. That is the social mobility of revolutionary France. So he makes general, basically. He's only about 24, 25 years old. And, just to tell you where we're standing in terms of the wars, it's a bit confusing because you keep seeing this term coalition. Like if you're reading, I think even Kennedy at one point confuses the coalitions. I think in the end there were actually 7 of them, during the Napoleonic period. And I'm not going to expect you necessarily to remember every single coalition. Technically the first one was just Prussia and Austria. And then the second one is when Spain and Holland and England join in 1793. So really the main war, you could call it the War of the First and Second Coalitions, lasts really from 92 to 95 when the coalitions are more or less together. The French, by all rights, should have lost this first war. Because after all, they're up against Austria, Prussia, Britain. They're facing Holland. They're facing Spain. So it seems like it's impossible. They had a couple of advantages. One, again, yes, there was more meritocracy in the French army. You have a lot more talent like Napoleon. Men fighting now, songs like the Marseillaise, everyone is motivated because they think they're fighting for, the revolution and fraternité and all of that. But some of it was that, the problem with any coalition is you have the command issue, who's really in charge, different priorities. In fact, Prussia in particular was distracted because at almost the same time as these wars were being fought out, Russia and Prussia, with the kind of connivance of Austria, they're engaged in carving up Poland. It's called the First and Second Partitions of Poland. Poland disappears from the map basically in 1795. And this is something which it was obviously significant for Poles. In some sense, it was also significant for the Ottoman Empire because the Poles had always been kind of an ally because they shared enmity with Russia. So some of it is the selfishness of the Prussians and the Russians that keep them from focusing on France. Some of it, I think I talked about this famous episode in August of 1793, where the Prussian commander and the English commander, they were really only about less than 100 miles from Paris, but they split up because of this order from London where the Duke of York is told to go secure Dunkirk. So some of it is the French are also getting lucky. But some of it, again, is the talent of men like Napoleon. And by 1795, they've more or less kind of routed their enemies. The Austrians are still at war with them. They've reached the Rhine River. They've already taken over what is now Nice, the French Riviera. So they look like they're more or less winning the war. Napoleon is kind of, the most famous, not necessarily the most famous general yet. But things are looking promising. Napoleon actually temporarily doesn't even really have a command. Like a lot of the generals in between campaigns, he would come back to Paris. And here's where politics begins intersecting. Basically, you had this politician. Barras was his name. And he's a bit like Napoleon. He's an opportunist. He's not someone who really has great conviction. He sort of blows with the wind. He sees which way the wind is blowing. He had been more or less an ally of Robespierre. Then he had helped secure Robespierre's fall. And now he's looking ahead to the future. You have this government I talked about. It's usually referred to as the Directory. Lasts from 1795 to 1799. It was forgettable, basically. I mean, it was kind of like the most cynical and probably the least idealistic of all of the revolutionary governments. It was controlled by an oligarchy, but then they had a parliament of 500, which was meant to make it look democratic, but it really wasn't. It was more like you had a kind of cabinet of the oligarchs. It was very corrupt, wasn't terribly popular, almost ever, really. And in the end, they realized that their position, a lot of these people have been making a lot of money, through profiteering and so on. The inflation is still running rampant. And the mob is, again, still kind of part of the equation. Well, Barras decides that, he needs some muscle, behind this government. And so a couple of things happen at once. First, he's starting to he notices Napoleon. He thinks this is a man maybe he can use. He then decides to introduce Napoleon to one of his mistresses. Rose de Beauharnais was her name, although she's known to history as Josephine. It's a very interesting relationship because Napoleon was still fairly young at this point. He was, I guess, about 26. He wasn't terribly experienced with women. I'm sure he had had some kind of adventure while he was, out near the battlefield. But on the other hand, he was a very kind of ruthless, single-minded man. He had never had a lot of time for courtship. Probably never had a serious girlfriend. Rose de Beauharnais had already had 3 children, and she had had a succession of husbands and, affairs, basically. She lived by her wits and her charms. And she was older than Napoleon. She was about 30 already. In fact, it's interesting. The fact that she had already had 3 children is significant because for various reasons, probably to do with, shall we say, illicit back alley abortions. She was no longer fertile, although Napoleon did not know this. Famously, she never did bear him any children. Well, anyway, so Napoleon he's floored. He's overwhelmed. You know, she's very sophisticated. You know, she's an older woman who's been around the block. You know, she knows basically how to kind of, you know, touch a man's buttons. So Napoleon he's sort of, again, he's interested now in Josephine. They don't get married right away. Barras, though, is still controlling Josephine. And so Barras is starting to manipulate Napoleon from behind the scenes. This all happens sort of simultaneously with the first major milestone on Napoleon's kind of rise to power, which we usually refer to, again, by the French revolutionary calendar as Vendémiaire. The actual date was the 5th of October, 1795. And this is the episode I think I alluded to last week. We usually refer to it as the whiff of grape shot. Grape shot being the particular type of, well, there were several ways of doing it. You could use a kind of an actual tin, but you could also use canvas in the way that the Navy tended to when they were trying to knock out, you know, the main sailing, the main sails, you know, the mainmast. The idea that you would have like a bunch of, you know, little musket balls inside a canvas bag that would then explode like shrapnel. I said, you know, not unlike the way certain modern terrorists will pack nails and such into bombs, although they're trying to kill. What this was designed to do as far as crowd control was to maim, that is to injure, you know, relatively seriously but without killing. You would have to fire it into the crowd, though, at almost point-blank range. And so the men who were in charge of firing, they had to be exceptionally courageous. I mean, that's a lot of what warfare was really about in this era. You know, you didn't have the kind of mobility of the modern armies that you had, obviously, cavalry on horseback. You also didn't have the firepower, the accuracy that you would, you know, 100 years later. So a lot depended on men being able to hold their cool, basically, in close order battle. Wait until the last possible minute before firing, when the crowd was virtually on top of you. And the same would be true in the battlefield because of the limited range, you know, of the muskets. So they waited until the crowd was virtually on top of them, and then they just let fly. And, you know, it was carnage in the street. A few people died, but for the most part, hundreds were injured. It was not a very nice way of handling things, but it was effective. There were no more journées. The whole phenomenon of the crowd in the French Revolution was over. There was a funny line, I think it was Carlyle, a British writer in his own history of the Revolution. You know, he said, basically what happened in Vendémiaire was, poof, the French Revolution became a thing that was. It was over. I mean, it was over in the sense of, you know, revolutionary mobs kind of patrolling the streets. Napoleon takes control of the city, and he becomes the man of the hour. Now, again, it's all happening about the same time as, you know, Barras is kind of introducing Napoleon to Josephine and all of this. And Josephine, I mean, frankly, she doesn't really like Napoleon that much. I mean, I think it's pretty clear. You know, the fact that she didn't even join him when he went to Egypt, I think, says something. But she realized that he was the coming man, and, you know, after all, a woman who's aging, who's, you know, 30, in an era when people didn't live that long, she's not going to do a whole lot better than him. And so even if she keeps her other lovers on the side, you know, she figures she might as well go ahead and, you know, and kind of take up the affair and then marry him. But so meanwhile, Barras is kind of controlling him behind the scenes. Barras is figuring, you know, look, I need to hitch my own star, you know, to his wagon. And through his connections and so on, Napoleon gets the Great Plum assignment, which is what's usually referred to simply as the Italian campaign. Austria, it's confusing because Italy didn't exist yet. Most of northern Italy, north of Rome, was still controlled by the Habsburgs, who were, in some ways, again, the principal and the traditional opponent of France. Particularly the upholders, the Habsburg family. I mean, what they stood for was legitimacy by lineal descent, and particularly by marriage. Again, this very peculiar European phenomenon. Everything was about, you know, law, tradition, which family married other families. And now the French are all about, you know, force, basically, and bloodshed. So Austria is kind of like the ideological opponent. And so Napoleon goes to destroy Austrian power. And this is where you began to see this element of kind of almost humbug, in the French Revolution. I call it humbug because, when they originally declared war on Austria, they said, look, we're not declaring war on the people of Austria. We're declaring war on the king, on all kings. But we're friends with the people. So you see, we're going to liberate you, right? We're going to liberate you from the nobles and the clergy and the kings and so on. Robespierre, you remember, had actually been a skeptic back then. He actually said no one likes armed missionaries. But Napoleon, he was actually kind of cheerful about the way he said this. He said, look, yeah, we're going to go liberate you in Italy from the Habsburgs and their illegitimate rule. But here's what he said to his soldiers, and I quote, "Soldiers, you are naked and ill-fed. But rich provinces and great towns will soon be in your power, and in them you will find honor, glory, and wealth. Soldiers of Italy, will you be wanting in courage and steadfastness in obtaining these things? Or as the line put it, we come to break your chains, that is, we will free you. And meanwhile, we'll help ourselves to your livestock, to your cows, to your farms, to your women, to your artwork, to your icons, to your jewelry, to your gold." Remember that the French Revolution had started because of a financial crisis, right? Now the crisis didn't just disappear. Remember, they had a couple of ways of dealing with it. The assignat, this was like a new, sort of almost a bond they issued against the church lands, which they then started buying and selling like a regular currency, and its value starts to plummet. The debts and the bonds, they're still paying high interest on those. They have to keep borrowing more money. And now you begin to see the use and the value of a soldier such as Napoleon to a cynical government like the Directors, people like Barras. Napoleon actually decides that he doesn't need a whole lot of money to fund his campaigns. His men will sort of fund them themselves in the field. Northern Italy was the perfect spot. Italy, remember, not only going back to the days of ancient Rome, but more recently going back to the kind of glory days of the Renaissance, the great trading cities like Genoa, Venice, to a lesser extent Florence, but particularly the coastal cities like Venice, who had always controlled, you remember, the kind of oriental carry trade with spices and silk with the Ottoman Empire. They were, as we know today, if you go to Venice, you can tell, okay, Venice is no longer important, but you can tell there's immense wealth there. You can also tell if you go to Paris. Has anyone been to Paris? I always ask, but I keep forgetting. Have you been to the Louvre? Yeah. Well, so you see there's a lot of great artwork in the Louvre. And where did most of it come from? Italy, right. And how did it end up in Paris? Well, mostly. It wasn't like they got it all during these campaigns. But yes, they more or less just helped themselves to whatever they wanted. Although Napoleon did this in a very interesting way. Again, he had a kind of genius not just for warfare, but for getting the soldiers to obey him. Getting the soldiers to feel like they were almost like partners. Okay, and here's one of the ways he did this. He actually set up a system to systematize and organize the distribution of loot from the battlefield. Whatever the soldiers could get. Now, this is always a problem for any commander. Even if you're winning, the soldiers might run out of control, right? They might, they might fill their pockets to the point where they can no longer walk, They might spend their time, getting lost, again, raping women or stealing this or stealing that. And discipline might break down, and then the army itself is not able to profit because people might then leave, right? If your pockets are full of jewelry and diamonds, you might decide to desert the army. So what Napoleon came up with was a way where everyone could deposit their winnings, you might call it. A little bit like, in a casino. If you have your chips, like cashing in your chips. He said, look, you can take what you want, but just deposit it with the regimental cashier. And we will then take a cut, and we will arrange so that, whenever you do finish your service and you go back to France, you will be able to profit. So we'll keep track of who steals what. It's kind of ingenious. He actually developed a way then for the men to loot Italy, but in a kind of organized manner. so that they could keep track of everything with precise records. And it worked very well. I mean, they rout the Austrian armies. They set up these kind of these sort of puppet states. They called them republics, whatever that meant. Yes, they were supposedly getting rid of feudalism and mortmain and the prerogatives of the church and so on. But basically, they just set up a bunch of puppet states. This is the Treaty of Campo Formio, 1797, treaty between Austria and France, where most of northern Italy is now, again, they're sort of like these satellite states of France. Well, anyway, Napoleon he's a great hero now. I mean, he has essentially destroyed Austrian power more or less forever, it seems. He's conquered northern Italy, where France had always had pretensions. I mean, going back to the time of the Renaissance when the French had invaded. He's done everything the Directory could have asked for. He's done it without costing a lot of money because, they're sort of looting and paying for the trip himself. But meanwhile, it's a little bit dangerous, too, if you're the politicians, right? Because this would always be true like in ancient Rome, if you looked at what Pompey or Caesar would do. Would they come back with an occupying army? Would they set themselves up as dictators? So the directors, not being stupid, of course, they're all going to kiss up to Napoleon and tell him what a genius he is. But they also don't really want him in their hair. And so they come up with a way of, as they see it, kind of getting rid of him. They tell him, why don't you go invade England? Because Britain, after all, I mean, the thing about the coalitions, remember, you got the first, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh. The one constant in all of them except for the first is that Britain is part of them, basically. I mean, that you can summarize this like I do in the syllabus. It's a simplification, but you can summarize the whole thing as kind of a struggle for power between Britain and France. The other countries come and go in the various coalitions. You have the Austrians, the Russians, the Prussians, even the Spanish at times, even some of the Italian states, the Dutch. Britain is almost always there. So the Directory says, well, if that is where the ultimate fount of resistance to French power lies, you should invade England. Well, Napoleon spends a few minutes thinking about it. Well, okay, maybe a week or two, I don't know. And he says, no thanks. I don't want to invade Britain. Partly because British naval power is supreme enough that he realizes, if he puts any army out to sea in the English Channel, they will stand probably a very small chance of making it to Britain without, losing at least a number of their ships. So it comes up with another idea. Well, to be more precise, it was kind of like a couple of people at the same time coming up with the same idea. Now, Napoleon had read a book back about 5 or 10 years ago. A book written by Volney. I think it was called Description de l'Égypte. Basically kind of like a description of Egypt from the visit of, this French kind of naturalist, man of the Enlightenment, jack of all trades. It had fired the imagination. And some of this is just, it's kind of almost like from, intellectual life. Egypt. People had heard about the pyramids, obviously. They'd heard about them, whether or not they had seen them. Up to this day, it's still kind of a mystery how the pyramids were built. So there are various legends about some ancient culture in Egypt, but no one knows very much about it. No one knows really anything about what it was like, in part because you had this thing called the hieroglyph. The Egyptian manner of writing, the hieroglyphics, had not yet been deciphered, and so no one knew what any of those documents said. There was some vague notion that Egyptian civilization might have preceded the Greeks, but most people thought that civilization had begun with ancient Greece. So anyway, a lot of kind of intellectuals are writing and talking about Egypt. It's almost like a craze, the first craze of Egyptology, or what would later be called Orientalism. And Napoleon, oddly enough, fancies himself a bit of an intellectual. So some people, I think, start telling Napoleon about this. Among them is the great diplomat Talleyrand. We'll encounter him repeatedly in the next couple of weeks. Now he, like Barras, he's kind of again, he's an opportunist, a pragmatist, a man without great principles. In fact, it's said of Talleyrand that he actually came originally from the clergy. He was actually educated in the church. And the first thing he did upon completing his seminary training, upon being appointed, I don't remember if it was bishop or a rank below bishop, he went to visit Voltaire, who, remember, was the great atheist attacker of the Catholic Church, écraser l'enfant and all that. So he was a cynic. He was a pragmatist. And Talleyrand, again, it's a bit of a mystery whether Talleyrand came up with the idea first or Napoleon did. Talleyrand was about to propose the idea when Napoleon proposed it himself. They said, why don't we invade Egypt? Why not? I mean, it's a strange idea, but there's a kind of romance to it. Napoleon is already starting to think of himself as something like a modern Alexander. And anyway, the way he pitches the idea to the directors, some of it has to do with economics. Egypt, because of its climate, they think might be suitable for growing sugar, or maybe cotton. They're not sure. You remember I talked about sugar in geopolitics, that because the Europeans had figured out how to grow sugar in the Caribbean, they no longer had to buy it, from the Islamic world. This was also now true, though, that because Britain had more or less cut France off from most of its colonies in the Caribbean, they needed another supply of sugar. So some of it was kind of economic. We can colonize Egypt, maybe, grow sugar, maybe cotton. But he was also talking about conquering essentially the whole Middle East and eventually going to India and destroying India there. So the romantic idea of kind of an Alexander. But then Napoleon also, once he kind of started looking into the idea, he got more and more interested in it. He started reading up on Islam. He read the Quran. He actually had a copy of the Quran in his private library. Interestingly, it was put in the section under politics, not religion, of his personal library. But so anyway, he assembles a vast army. Not that vast. I think one of your readings says 31,000. That's what he told the directors, but he actually sent 40,000 men to Egypt. And they conquer Alexandria. They got lucky again. Napoleon had a lot of luck. They got lucky. They evaded the British fleet. Eventually, they weren't lucky. Nelson actually, at the Battle of the Nile, as it's called, it's really the mouth of the Nile. Nelson actually destroyed the French fleet, but that was after Napoleon and his men had already landed in Egypt. So they take Alexandria on the coast. They march up very slowly towards Cairo. And by the time they get there, this is at the Battle of the Pyramids. I think I wrote that here somewhere. This is in July 1798. This is where he gives another one of his famous speeches, men, soldiers, 40 centuries of history are looking down on you. Now, they weren't right next to the pyramids. The pyramids were like 10 or 15 miles away, but they could kind of just see them in the distance. They were just on the other side of the Nile from old Cairo. And they were up against, I guess you could call it, in a manner of speaking, an Ottoman force, except that it was led by the Mamluks. Mamluk being an Arabic word, although I think in Turkish you probably spell it like this, Mamluk. Basically, the word meant slave. A little bit like the Janissaries and like the Kul and the Kapakulu. They had been mostly recruited in more recent years from the Caucasus. Originally, they were of Turkic origin, and then they came from the mountain peoples of the Caucasus. And anyway, they had their own warrior traditions, similar to, but not identical to those of the Janissaries. There was an Ottoman governor in Egypt that was still technically, again, ruled by the Ottomans, and it did send tribute back to Istanbul, to Constantinople. The Mamluks, they sort of like ran amok. They sort of like ran their own affairs. And anyway, the Mamluk forces, not just cavalry, but infantry, they're all ranged against Napoleon on the battlefield. Now, Napoleon later exaggerated the numbers, and he said the French were, outnumbered 2 or 3 to 1. In terms of effectives, it wasn't quite so dramatic. Probably the Mamluks disposed of 30 to 40,000 men, some of whom weren't even that well armed, because some of them had just kind of come in from Cairo and just taken whatever they could get with them. Napoleon had up to about 20,000. He had to leave a lot of men behind Alexandria, guarding supply lines. So yes, the French are outnumbered, not necessarily as dramatically as you might think. Still, though, if I give you the statistic of the battle, let's see, roughly 10,000 were killed on the Mamluk side. Call that the Egyptian side. Against, what was the exact number? 29 Frenchmen. Now, even though the French didn't end up staying in Egypt that long, you could still make the case that the Battle of the Pyramids was rather a central, crucial battle in modern history, simply for what it illustrated about essentially the balance of power now between Europe and the Islamic world. How did the French do this? Well, it was, in a way, it was simple. Again, I talked about discipline. I talked about order and drill in the way, let's say even with the whiff of grape shot, when they're just trying to quiet the crowd, they had to wait until the last possible minute. That's basically what the French did. They had squares. A square just literally meaning like a square. With the men all facing out. And they actually had 2 or 3 rows. The bayonets are all bayonets fixed, essentially going out from the square. Then people inside the square would feel more or less safe. And that's where they put they called them the donkeys. Napoleon actually invited several hundred intellectuals along the expedition. Mathematicians and philosophers and artists and writers, propagandists, many of them. And they would all stay in the middle of the square where it was safe, along with the commanding generals. And then what they would basically do was just wait. They would wait for the Mamluks to charge, many of them, on horseback. And they would charge, and then the men would just have to stand there with bayonets drawn and wait till the last possible minute to fire, to where the horse was practically falling on top of you. In some ways, it was an incredible military feat, not least because these men had just marched for miles across the desert. Many of them were suffering from diarrhea because all that they had had to drink was bad watermelons. But they held their ground. Obviously, only 29 of them died against 10,000 of the enemy. And you also had some interesting illustrations of the differences in military culture. The leading Mamluk warriors, some of them actually, when their bodies were discovered, one of them actually had 500 gold coins actually like wrapped around his body. And they all tended to have, again, these kind of like elaborate costumes. I talked in the very first lecture about that scene in the Indiana Jones movie, like the Great Warrior. It was a little bit like that. They have these like elaborate flowing robes, but which offer absolutely no protection. They were weighed down they tended to carry a lot of their valuables with them. They were just as courageous as the French, but they obviously weren't as well led, and they didn't have the right tactics to handle these squares. Well, anyway, so the French win. Now, they conquer Cairo. And you get this amazing kind of a story which commences. The French actually, for at least a couple of years, they're ruling Egypt. They set up like scientific institutes. They send all these, the savants, the intellectuals, they send up to the Upper Nile. They discover the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone was literally a stone tablet on which, several ancient languages were, written. They didn't figure it out right away, but within a couple of years, actually with the help of some British scholars, they deciphered hieroglyphics. And that is what allowed these French scholars eventually to kind of discover the ancient civilization of Egypt and how it functioned. They discovered lots of ruins. They did paintings of monuments. The whole thing was, kind of very grand. It was also very strange because France was actually, after all, ruling an Islamic country. And Napoleon, again, remember this whole thing about, we come to break your chains. They actually sent Talleyrand. Talleyrand was supposed to actually go to Istanbul, to Constantinople, and tell the Turks that Napoleon meant them no harm. We're invading Egypt, but we mean you no harm. We are trying to overthrow the tyrannical rule of the Mamluks and restore, the proper law and order, blah, blah, blah. As you might expect, this didn't go over well with the Turks, who, once they had heard about the Battle of the Nile, that the French Navy had been destroyed, they declared war. I can tell people are getting a little restless. Are we at the end of the first hour? Okay, we will take a short break of about 10 minutes. What time is it? 32. Okay, 10 minutes.